Hello, welcome to the fourth attempt so far to review this really exceptional book, The Light Princess and Other Tales of Fantasy by George MacDonald. Now, the other thing this book claims is that it is the complete fairy tales of George MacDonald, so take it as fantasy or take it as fairy tales, whichever one it is. It is a gorgeous little collection of 8 stories. Only 8 stories. And that is why I've been now reading it for months, because far from difficult to read, it is gorgeous, and I've wanted to relish and enjoy every last second that I could, since apparently 8 stories are the complete fairy tales. I'm not sure about that is actually true anymore. Let's start with the book. I have got this absolutely beautiful little hardcover edition from London, Victor Gollancz Limited, 1973, with an introduction by Roger Lansdowne Green. As you can see from this lovely front page. It's a hardcover. Hardcovers aren't always my favourite, but it's a very reasonably sized hardcover, and it will still fit on my custom shelves, I believe. And it's got a nice heft, it's fun to read, it's in startlingly good condition for its age, with a little bit of, I guess, foxing and staining. The dust jacket is in quite superb condition, and the book underneath, as the dust jacket is meant to do, has been protected. I found it, I believe, in a small bookshop that is like the Spirit of Bookshops up on the Tablelands somewhere. And it was an old dusty bookshop that will not last any longer than its owner, and I'm very glad I found it. I believe that's where this came from. The cover design is beautiful, and the cover illustration is from the illustrations inside. So the cover design is by John Duet, whoever they may be, but that actual illustration comes from inside, where all the illustrations were done by Arthur Hughes. Here I can find, I'm pretty sure I can find, black and white that it comes from. The illustrations in this, by the way, are utterly gorgeous. These are illustrations that one could very easily and very happily hang on one's wall, framed. Okay, I'll find the other illustration later. Right. George MacDonald. I knew virtually nothing about, except that one of my childhood books was The Princess and the Goblin, and I later found The Princess and Curdie, and they were both great books. They had that true fairy tale element to them. And I'm just going to briefly touch on the fact that, to me, fairy tales, myths, and children's tales are very distinct. They don't really cross over. They fulfill different functions within the society. Children's stories are stories that were written by adults, or sometimes by children, for other children, specifically for the child to enjoy. A fairy tale is something quite different. It needs to tap into the subconscious ethos. It needs to be able to represent society to the person who's listening, and by the telling of the fairy tale, and they were originally told stories, not only is the often younger person being inducted into their society's beliefs and mores, but the older person is reinforcing them. Fairy tales are great stuff, and if you're interested in reading more about fairy tales and how much they matter to the psyche and how important they are to cultures, I would say Marie-Louise von France, Shadow and Evil in Fairy Tales. I know I push this book at the camera a lot, but it's worth it. And then, of course, you've got myths. Myths tend to be cultural examinations of time and place. There's an element of social belief in them, but they're far more generic. Then you've got crossover between all these three. Then again, you've got science fiction and fantasy, specifically fantasy stories, which this is what it calls. This book calls itself Tales of Fantasy. George MacDonald, who was born in 1824 in Scotland and died in 1905, was a novelist of Scottish life, apparently, according to the Britannica. And he wrote Christian allegories and was remembered chiefly for his fairy stories. He was a congregational minister. I think that means something specific in Scotland, I'm not sure what. Then a freelance preacher and lecturer. And I always thought it was just this obscure guy who'd written a few fairy stories. No, I was wrong. George MacDonald is apparently massive. He's got pages and pages of him about him on the internet. There's a whole GeorgeMacDonalds.com society talking about him. He actually wrote far more non-fiction than he ever did fiction. I think a lot of it was in terms of essays and sermons. That's the word. Sermons. But his fantasy and fantastical stories are exceptional, and they totally transform a basic fairy tale. They elevate it, if you will, into something that is appropriate for any age group, and it transcends genre. There is no story in here that I don't believe that you can look at and say this is this specific genre, because they all have elements, and some of them are very, very exceptionally weird and wonderful, and a few of them are even wild. So the first in this collection is The Light Princess. And The Light Princess is somewhere in my tabs. Oh, this is embarrassing. Okay, so that was written as a Scottish fairy tale published in 1864 as a story within a larger story by MacDonald, which I haven't read, called Adela Cathcart. And it's got inspiration from Sleeping Beauty. So your average modern person reading this will see a lot of similarities between it and Sleeping Beauty. It's got that very known fairy tale child story element. And that front piece is from The Christening, where an evil witch, in this case the sister of the king, who is a witch, comes to the christening uninvited. The king forgot to invite her. He's a bit muddle-headed, and they was really excited because him and his queen haven't been able to have any other children. It's been so long, etc., etc. So his sister is Princess Macamnoit, something like that. And she is spiteful and angry. When she arrives, the king doesn't even realize that he's failed to invite her. He's happy to see her. He welcomes her to the party. But when it comes time for the gifting, what she gifts her is a lack of gravity. Quite different from Sleeping Beauty. Quite different from any fairy tale that's in current circulation that I know of. So here we've got this rather nice illustration playing at ball. Now they're not throwing the princess per se, and as such she's floating like a helium balloon, because at this point she has no feeling of gravity. She can't be connected to the earth at all. And while that's uncomfortable for everyone concerned, they deal with it, they get on. But as she grows, it's found that this lack of gravity translates to other things as well. Not only has she no gravity to the earth, she has no gravity to human feelings. So essentially she doesn't have the emotions that you would expect from a human being. She can't emote, she can't connect, she doesn't understand other people's emotions. Almost pure psychopath there. And she fails to be able to get any interest in these things. But she grows to a beautiful young woman. Eventually, she discovers water. And, oh God, I totally hang that on the wall. And when she discovers water, she discovers that there is something that can hold her. Because while she fears the sky and the air, like most people fear deep water, the water holds her, and she no longer has to worry about blowing away in the wind. So she swims in the lake by the castle often. Now, of course, it's a fairy story, and along comes a prince. The prince is lost in the forest from a far kingdom, and he goes to the lake and he sees this beautiful woman swimming there, I think, at night. Falls in love with her. Through all these machinations, manages to stay in the forest and come out, meet the princess, and they form a strong connection through swimming in the lake together. Now, it's been a while since I read this one, and I didn't write any notes for it. But eventually, the lake begins to dry up. And as the lake begins to dry up, the princess starts to basically die off. she's so linked to the lake by now that there's no way for her to continue to exist without it, and it's so shallow she can't swim properly. Eventually they find that there's a curse, but there's a way in which the lake can be saved, and thus obviously the princess and the kingdom. In order to do it, however, someone has to drown themselves. They have to go down to this hole at the bottom of the lake where the water's draining out and plug it with themselves as a free offering of themselves, and then the lake will slowly fill up. The prince, who is by now desperately in love with the light princess, will do that, and his soul, he goes to the king and says he's willing to do that. His sole condition is that the princess has to be with him while he does it. And here's a picture of the princess sitting on a boat staring down at the face of the prince who is about to be drowned, and that's where the front piece comes from. And you won't find it. The problem here is that the princess has that lack of gravity. She doesn't emote properly. She can't really feel or understand that the prince is drowning and he's suffering and he will die. She doesn't really know these things, and she can't understand them in others. And so obviously the prince doesn't die. There is a happy ending. It's discovered that this once again is a curse or a plot on the part of the evil princess, not Marmaduke, Mamalok, whatever, that one. And happily ever after. Actually, there was a musical version of this, by the way, in 2013, I believe, by Tori Amos, which I do think that I actually listened to at some stage. It's a really exceptional story in many ways, because you've got all these very clear fairy tale elements like the witch, the princess, curse, etc., etc. Then you've got some things that are purely fantastical, like floating. But throughout all of it runs this darker thread that is not childlike at all. As a fairy tale, it may work, because fairy tales don't have to be childish, and they don't have to be lying to children the world's a good place. But there's a very adult sub-theme throughout this one, which meant that I actually read it a second time shortly after. And as a story, it holds together very, very well as a single narrative in similar writing style throughout, which is not always the case in these stories. Okay, that was The Light Princess. It is, by the way, impossible to rate these stories. I could rate them against each other as one being better than the other, but I can't really rate them against other things because they are so unique. They don't really do completely subvert genres. They trample all over genres and rating systems and leave you sort of spinning. I'm going to reread all of them at one time or another. Yes, I am. You want to come? Join us in front of the camera? No, you don't. Of course you don't. The second story in this collection is The Giant's Heart. The Giant's Heart is allegedly a short story derived from a Norwegian fairy tale called The Giant Who Had No Heart in His Body. But the idea of a giant or an ogre or a wizard not keeping his heart inside his body is very, very common throughout the Midwest and East parts of Europe fairy tales. It's an ongoing story. This one is actually a little bit, more than a little bit different. It's not a particularly long story, but we start off, it's just this long, in fact, short. There was once a giant who lived on the borders of giant land where it touched on the country of common people. And somewhere near the borders on the other side, by the edge of a great forest, lived a labourer with his wife and a great many children. One day, Trixie Wee, as they called her, teased her brother Buffy Bob until he could not bear it any longer. So we've got these odd names. And I don't know that MacDonald's done that anywhere else. And I'm not sure if this is something derived from the Norwegian fairy tale, which I haven't read, but want to. But you've got these very, I guess, iconic characters. In that They're clearly not real people. Trixie Wee isn't a name. It's not even a nickname. These are basically almost spirit-like beings incarnating certain concepts. So anyway, they run off to have an adventure in a very Jack the Giant Killer type way, though they don't have to climb up a vine, they just have to climb over the mountains into giant land. And when they reach the giant's house, they find the giant, his wife, who is the friendly, helpful, character, though still connected to the giant, who is a bad guy, in that he eats kids. Now, I know that Jack, the Giant Killer, has that motif of fee, fi, fo, fum, eating you, but here, in the Giant's Heart, you actually have something a bit darker and a bit more explicit. Here's the giant in his house, and down the bottom there you can perhaps only just see there's a whole heap of small squirming boys, because what he does is he catches boys from outside Giant Land, he brings them to his house, he keeps them there, feeding them until they're fat, and then he eats them. And it's quite... it's not a concept that's unusual for fairy stories or for children's stories, that there's consequences, that there's bad things out there. But it seems a little bit harsh, maybe even Norwegian, in the way it's told here. So Trixie Wee and Buffy Bob, manage to hide throughout this. They hide under the broom and they manage to escape from the giant, and the giant's wife gives them some information on what they can do, which is find his heart, which is elsewhere. She can't tell them where it is because he won't even trust her with that information, which makes her very sad. There's also this other weird element to this, which is the giant always wears white socks on a Sunday. I think it's a Sunday, or one day of the week he always wears his white socks, and his wife is at great pains to keep them white and make sure they're good, and she complains about this. I feel like there's some subtext there, something that is being conveyed to me that I'm not quite getting, but it's a major thread throughout the story. Anyhow, our two childish protagonists have escaped the giant's house, and they run away. They run up trees, where there is a vast number of birds of all kinds that help them. There are larks, there are owls, there are a huge number of birds, both good and selfish, kind and helpful in different ways, and they use them to guide them to where the giant's heart might be. There's also at this point poetry. George MacDonald, by the way, was also a poet, and I'm sure I've read some of his work, though it doesn't spring to mind. I believe that poetry is a bit more saccharine than the stories. So eventually they do find the heart, and they've also got these helpful spiders. I can't remember where the spiders came from, but they were helpful spiders, and they taught them how to subdue the giant by pinching his heart and pouring spider poison on it. So if there's spider poison on the heart, then the giant is basically unable to do anything. They go back to the giant's house with his heart, and the giant is pleading and begging them to give it back to him, and they're making conditions that he has to go and release all his captive boys that are meant to be food back into the common land. He has to swear to never do it again. He has to swear not to wear white stockings on a Sunday, and all these things. Anyhow, this has got a slightly darker ending. It's an odd sort of story. I could probably do a whole review on it. I practically have. And there is a happy ending. It's not necessarily an unexpected one. Unlike the next one. The next one is called The Shadows. The Shadows is exceptionally odd. Exceptionally odd. And in fact, I tried to research this online. There is virtually nothing about it. And I would say that that's because most people don't know how to take it and don't know what to make of it. In The Shadows, our main protagonist is old Ralph Rinkelman, who made his living by comic sketches and all but lost it again by tragic poems. So he was just the man to be chosen king of the fairies, for in fairyland the sovereignty is elective. Not your classic fairy tale at all, and not, I believe, the type of fairy tale that is consistent with the fairy stories of the British Isles. So I don't know where this one came from. I could be wrong. Tell me if I am. I'm happy with it. But anyway, so Ralph Rinkelmann is this ordinary old guy living in an ordinary old house with his ordinary old wife and kids. The fairies decide that he's going to be their king, and apparently kidnap him to fairyland so he can be there for the coronation, though he doesn't have to live there afterwards. After the coronation, you've got a whole lot of hobgoblins and stuff that object to his being king. It feels like there's a whole book worth of story that I don't know about. It feels like this whole election of him to be king of fairies must be a story somewhere. I can't find it. Internet won't tell me about it. So, next thing that happens, he's back at home in his bedroom. He's been sick, by the way. And all these shadows start appearing. The room was full of dark creatures which gamboled about in the firelight in such a strange, huge, though noiseless fashion that he thought at first that some of his rebellious goblins had not been subdued with the rest, but had followed him beyond the bounds of fairyland. How else could these mad, grotesque, hippopotamus calves make their ugly appearance in Ralph Rinkelmann's bedroom? Well, they're not fairyland inhabitants per se and as such, but when he became king of the fairies, he also became king of the shadows, and the shadows are weird as. They are what we know of as shadows, and they're clearly sourced at least partly from people who, in the 1800s, who lived in rooms without electric light, so you had that flickering light and the shadows seemed to move and would scare children and adults alike. They can come through walls, they can come through doors, they can't really communicate with people until they do something to Ralph Rinkelmann whereby he can see them. And what they want is for Ralph, as their king, to be better acquainted with him because they are His Majesty's subjects. It's a weird story. The shadows are bizarre. There's this whole subculture, sub-existence of creatures that are shadows that aren't anything else and aren't part of everything else. It's pretty good. At one point, as per this gorgeous, gorgeous picture, Ralph Rinkelmann is lifted out of his bed. You can see him there on the stretcher. You might not be able to see his crown. It's not terribly clear. Though he's sick, they take him on a stretcher throughout the land to some frozen lake where they're holding some sort of congress. They talk a lot about going to church, but when the king tries to figure out what the church is, it clearly isn't church as we know it in any fashion. And what exactly it is meant to represent, at no point do I really understand. Now, here's a point to mention. That George MacDonald was apparently associated with Christian existentialism, which was a philosophical movement taking an existential approach to Christian theology, whatever that means. I'm not really sure. But it's based on the work of a Danish philosopher from the early to mid-1800s, and it seems likely that George MacDonald was very influenced by it as well. I suspect that a lot of elements of the shadows and the morality in them comes from this Christian existentialism. Now, after the shadows have all convened by the lake and they're all talking to the king about themselves, this story does this quick shift, because up until then it is actually quite scary. These shadows are not human and they don't think like humans, but they can affect humans and they can do a whole lot of things that we don't understand, and we don't understand why they're doing them. So it is a genuinely creepy, genuinely scary story up to then. Now at this point, the king is also wrangling with them angrily, because when they come to visit him in his house, they go upstairs and frighten the children. But the shadows contest that. They can frighten people, but they claim that that's not what they're about. And from then on, we have this really quite long section where the shadows talk about all the games that they play on people. And the idea is that they're always doing this to improve the human, or out of a sense of morality that seems very baseline Christian, and the morality there is childish. It's suited for children's stories. So I don't know, did he start to write the shadows and think this is too adult, this is too scary, this is too immoral in a way, that we have to make these shadows be there to make people better people? Here's a illustration of one of the stories in the shadows have, where the miser and his wife do stuff. Again, this is another story that you could read or reread many, many times and probably never quite get where it's coming from, and never quite get what it's trying to do. I probably will read it again. Okay, the next one we have got is the Carasoyn, I think. The Carasoyn is Carasoyn, and I did try to figure out if it was actually based on something real. Is it a Scottish word for a wine or a mead or what? But I never really managed to figure it out. Now, the Carasoyn is apparently, at least the first part of it originally appeared in another book, The Fairy Fleet in Argosy in 1866. The Carasoyn is an expanded version of that initial fairy tale, and it first appeared in 1871. This is where children's fairy tale meets fantasy in a big way. It is strange, and the initial part is pure fairy tale children's story. Once upon a time there lived in a valley in Scotland a boy about 12 years of age, the son of a shepherd. His mother was dead, and he had no sister or brother. His father was out all day in the hills with his sheep, but when he came home at night, he was as sure of finding the cottage neat and clean, the floor swept, a bright fire, and his supper waiting for him, as if he had had a wife and daughter to look after his household instead of only a boy. Okay, sure, written in the 1800s, whatever, I'm with it. Now, Colin, at one stage, looks at this beautiful little creek that's running outside a burn, I think, running outside the cottage. But once it meets the cottage yard with the cow and the pig, it gets all mucky and nasty. And he thinks to himself, wouldn't it be a cool idea if I diverted the stream through to run through the house? That way we'd have water on tap and all the other benefits. So he was thinking of indoor plumbing already in 1866, was Colin. Now he does that thing, and his father's okay with it. And then that first night after he's diverted it, Colin's in bed, and he lies for a while, for some time, gazing at the faint glimmer of the water and the dull red light from the sod-covered fire, and listening to its sweet music as it hurried through to the night again, till its murmur changed into a lullaby and sung him fast asleep. And that's the other thing that I haven't mentioned about MacDonald. Most of the time his writing is absolutely gorgeous. It is beautiful. Now Colin then woke up in the middle of the night, and he found that a tiny fleet of fairies has come down this creek. He describes them as 2 feet tall, which seems too tall for me for fairies, but who am I to argue with an amazing person like George MacDonald? So the fairies are gambling around and doing their fairy thing, and eventually he hears a knocking from the headboard of his bed, and a little girl says to him, "Please save me. I was a real girl, but I've been stolen by the fairies and I don't want to be with them anymore." Colin tries to bargain with the Queen to get the little fairy girl, but because the Queen is older and smarter than him, she actually fools him into going to get the Carasoyn for her before he can get the little girl. The Carasoyn being this amazing wine that is implied to be able to restore happiness, which the Queen of the Fairies says she doesn't have. Now, how should he find this Carasoyn? He ends up remembering that there's an old woman spinning on the hillside who had told him such amazing stories and shown him the way home when he was lost, and had he thought she might be able to help him. Now here we've got one of those very clear mystic figures, very much like grandmother from The Princess and the Goblin, again with the spinning, which again harks back to older mythology that we won't get into now because this is taking a while. He goes to her, she tells him how to find the Carasoyn, and eventually he gets this wine and he manages to fool the little girl away from the fairies. But that isn't the end of this story. That first part is probably the part that originally appeared as a subpart of the fairy fleet. But Colin grows up, and the little girl that he saved from the fairies marries Colin, and they go to live in another part of the land, Devonshire. And they find out more about the fairies. The fairies were using the stream to escape from where they were living, and they end up pursuing or locating Colin and his bride and stealing their son. This is pure fairy tale in many senses. You could absolutely make a case for fantasy, but it does feel like a fairy tale more than anything else, and it's a great fairy tale at that. Moving on to one that I think is probably more in the fairy tale fantasy level. We've got Little Daylight with, once again, lovely illustration. It was also included as a story within a story at the Back of the North Wind, which was published in 1971 and which I still haven't read. I want to. A king and a queen get a daughter, Gain. We don't hear about the messy parts of that, whom they name Daylight. And they once again invite all the fairies from the woods to their palace, except for one who's so newly arrived and living in the swamp that everyone's convinced she's a witch. Which indeed she is. And she curses the daughter, and when she hears her name, Little Daylight, she says it will be Little Daylight, as the princess would sleep all day, and that her vigour and her health and her well-being would wax and wane under the moon that she has to live under. Great concept, pure fairy tale. And once again, there's a handsome prince that manages to save her from the curse. If it's originally a story within a story, it's a very consistent one. This is one of the ones in which you have got a very consistent writing style throughout. It's fun, it's a fairy tale, it's very enjoyable. Next one we have is Cross Purposes. And this one is back in Weird Land territory. Yes, fairy tale, yes, mythic. I think maybe Mythopoetic, subgenre speculative fiction, maybe. So in this one, the Queen of Fairyland is finding her subjects far too well behaved to be amusing, so she asks for volunteers to go into the real world and bring back to humans to be more amusing and less well behaved. One of the volunteers is called Peasblossom, after her great-great-grandmother. Nod to Shakespeare. And there is a very Shakespearean element to this. Peasblossom outlines the method by which she plans to bring a girl, and then there is a goblin comes out of the mole heap and says he will bring the boy. He outlines the method by which he's going to do that. And they both go into the mortal land to entrap a boy and a girl. And here is the goblin entrapping the boy. The boy has saved all his money to buy an umbrella for his sick mother, thereby establishing his credentials as a good human being, but follows the goblin into fairyland, where he encounters the girl who isn't quite as nice, and the two of them do eventually escape fairyland. It's a great story, thoroughly recommended. And here we have Richard and Alice in Troubles. This illustration also reminds me a lot of the Princess and the Goblin illustrations. So maybe, quite possibly, Arthur Hughes did those illustrations as well, though they weren't framed like these ones were. Cross Purposes is a great story. Really well written, really holds together well. I loved every part of it. The next one is The Golden Key. This is a reasonably long one. This was originally published in Dealings with Fairies in 1867. And this is the one I stuck on a little bit until Liminal Spaces cured me of the stick. It's a longish story by the standards of this book, and it starts with a boy who goes to find the end of the rainbow, and when he's there he finds a golden key with sapphires on it, but he doesn't know what it opens. There's a lot of references to other things, to other stories, to a wider universe in this one. There's a lot to track down, but I didn't find it consistent. For example, when the boy's talking about looking for the golden key at the bottom of the rainbow, he asks his great aunt if anyone had ever found it, and she goes, yes, your father, I believe, found it. And he never told her what it opened with. So we've got the boy who goes off and finds that. And then we go on to another character, a little girl, daughter of a merchant, living with uncaring servants, and they call her Tangle because they never brush her hair. Now Tangle wanders out of her house one day, pursued by fairies, or as she believes, bears, and escapes to the forest where once again you've got this mythic, great, essential, elemental woman figure who gets her and the boy together, and they have to go look for the lock that the rainbow's key fits into. Why they have to do that, we don't know. Why they do the things they do, we don't know. How long does it take? We think it's quite a long time, because at one stage they're an old man and woman, though they don't stay an old man and woman. There's a lot that happens. Then they get separated and they each have separate adventures, all of which are good, but I found the writing here inconsistent and often difficult to follow. So a lot of people feel that the intensity of all these strange imagery elements in this book implies deep spiritual meaning without providing a transparent allegory for the events that are being described. And the older figures to the younger figures, and there's the older man of the earth, and then there's the oldest man of the earth who direct them in different ways. It seems to be, in some way, MacDonald was all about life, death, and the hope of an afterlife. There seems to be a lot of Christian classical mythology that is reincarnation type mythology and deified figures. I feel that this rainbow bridge that's in there is probably from Norse mythology, probably Bifrost, that reaches between Earth and Asgard, but it's so nebulously defined that I really don't know what MacDonald was trying to do here. Maybe on my second, third, or even possibly fifth reading, I will understand it. I don't understand the symbology, but I do feel like he was trying to meld together several different mythos sources that don't necessarily make a good fit. Just my possibly controversial opinion. And finally, this is a slog. Finally, we get to The Day Boy and the Night Girl, which has also at times been titled The Romance of Photogen and Nycteris. It's from 1882, and it was published, I believe, as a fairy tale novel, and The Golden Key, I think, was as well. They are the longer ones. And we start with a witch called Watho, and for no reason that we really know, she entices two women from a nearby court to come and stay in her amazing magical castle. One of these women is a recent widow who is blind, and she gets housed in this replica of an Egyptian tomb that a previous occupant, we hear, built in the hillside. The other one is a beautiful golden-haired woman whose husband is far away, and she gets lodged in this lovely set of apartments that looks out over the river and the forest, and everything is gorgeous. Now, exactly what Watho is trying to create here, we don't know, but there's this clear separation between day and night. In time, both of the two women bear a child. The widow dies, leaving her daughter alone in the tomb to be raised by Watho and her one trustworthy servant. The boy is born in the tower, but taken away by the witch as soon as he's born, so that his mother thinks his mother believes that he's dead. She goes back to court, reunites with her husband, and the boy is brought up in these apartments in the sun, as fully in the sun as possible. By her witchy arts, she makes it so the day boy never ever is awake at night, and the night girl is never ever awake in the daylight. The boy is well educated and taught all the things that educated young men are taught: riding, hunting, all that sort of stuff, how to be a brave man, all that sort of thing. The girl is taught nothing except how to play music. But she develops a very sweet heart on her own, and eventually she starts creeping out of her prison to see the world. But because she's always asleep during the day, she always comes out at the night. And because she has very little in the way of books or mental stimulation, she creates an imagery of the world around her to fit her understanding of it. She believes that the moon is actually the sun shining in the sky. She believes that the colours that she sees are everything. And she essentially creates an animistic worldview in that there's animus to everything. The stream is clearly alive. The flowers are clearly living beings. And she has got this very, very animistic, very beautiful, very innocent view of the world. Then again, you've got the boy who's photogen, who has never really been taught to think about anything, though he can kill anything in the area. So eventually one night, Photogen decides to stay awake against the instructions of the witch because he wants to hunt a snow leopard which only comes out at night. As soon as the sun sinks and the moon rises, he becomes terrified, and in the cowardice of fear he runs back to the castle where he encounters Nycteris, who has crept out that night. She defends him from the dark, which terrifies him, but when the sun rises, he cruelly leaves her burning in the sun, and all her kindness has been ignored. So this is not orthodox symbology, in that orthodox symbology and Christian symbology has light representing goodness and darkness standing for ignorance and evil. But in here, there's not that distinction. Far from it. In actual fact, in reading this, you're reminded far more of the Asian representation of yin and yang, the black side with the white dot, the white side with the black dot. So you've got that yin-yang thing that is much more balanced than the simple Orthodox Christian daylight mythology. There is evil in this book, but the evil is represented by Watho, the witch, who is eventually killed by the day boy, as we see in this rather pretty little image, with the night girl sitting in the background in the shade of the oak tree. He doesn't know she's the witch at the time. He thinks she's a giant red wolf, but that's aside. So we've got the evil, but the evil is not based either in the night or in the day. It's quite aside from them. And what is the intention of evil? What did the witch Watho mean to do with the day boy and the night girl? We don't really know, because she gets sick and irritated, chucks the girl out to die in the sun, and torments the boy until he escapes. Is this meant to be a symbology of how evil will defeat itself through its own inner processes? Maybe. The attempt to gather and subdue coming from outside the day and the night is the motivation that drives the story. The fact that we don't know what that motivation is, that it's never even hinted at, makes it essentially more of a fantasy story than a fairy tale, in my opinion. Because with a fantasy story, you don't need to know everything, whereas in fairy tales you're more likely to. So yes, I would definitely say this is far more in fantasy land than in fairy tale land. What else can we say? Both Photogen and Nycteris are trying to grow as individuals. Photogen is ashamed of his fear of the dark. Nycteris is terrified of the sun, which she thinks will burn her. And each helps the other to overcome their fear and move behind it. When they go to escape, they need to escape at night, which is when the witch Watho sleeps. So Nycteris assists the boy through the night, and then as the sun comes out, he lifts her and carries her. He has grown to regret his cavalier treatment of her the first time they met. So you've got this really beautiful symbol of self, and if you will, of a true marriage of a couple where together they become more than the sum of their parts. And there was apparently an opera based on this, though I haven't managed to trace it down yet. I'll totally watch it. This has been a really, really long review. If you're still watching, thank you very much for bearing with me, or putting it on while you do the dishes, or whatever you've done. This is a fantastic book. If you like original fantasy, I think you'll read it. If you like fairy tales from the 1800s, you will absolutely love it. And honestly, for anyone who's into classic fantasy, I really do recommend. Anyway, once again, read good books.